Hello guys and welcome to my new video, and today we'll be talking about a subject that I get asked on the daily basis. Restoration Druid or Preservation Evoker, which one's better, which one's more fun, which one's more interesting, what do they really provide? And this video is going to give you an overview of these two healers, with the hopes that this video is going to help you in terms of deciding which healer is more fun for you or more suited towards your end goals. Now, because these two healers are looking to be really strong in Mythic Plus, this video is going to be focusing on the Mythic Plus aspect, but I will also talk about some of the rating aspects and things like that. I'll talk about some of my Mythic Plus builds, the gameplay, and basically which healer is the right fit for your end game content. When you look at Mythic Plus meta in terms of what healers are perceived to be really strong, these are the two contenders. Preservation Evoker and RESTO DRUID are looking to be very wanted in Mythic Plus content, both in pugging and high-end Mythic Plus scenarios. But when you look at what each healer provides in terms of how they deal damage, in terms of how they heal, and the damage or the healing profiles that they have, they're very different. Preservation Evoker is the absolute king of burst healing, while RESTO DRUID really prevails in this sustained aspect. And let's go get started with Preservation Evoker. And this is my Evoker's Mythic 0 builds that I've been messing around with. I'm going to be changing a couple of things in the spec tree and the class tree. For example, the class tree, when Mythic Plus is being released, there's going to be Raging, and you'll want to pick up things to remove Raging. So that's a big important aspect that you can do. One of the big pluses of the class tree for Preservation or Evoker in general is the fact that you can pick up Interrupt quite easily, which is different for RESTO DRUID. And RESTO DRUID has to sacrifice a lot more to pick up Interrupt, so that's a negative for Resto. But Preservation Evoker, a lot of things that you can mess around here. I love Rescue. I've been using Rescue so much, and it's honestly one of the most fun abilities. Once you figure out how to use it properly, it's honestly one of the things that define this class. It's really fun. In terms of the spec tree, I like the Echo build. The Echo build, the advantages of it is that you can apply echoes, but you can proc echoes regardless of range, at least in Mythic Plus and things like that. And it makes it really interesting, because the Emerald Blossom build can be somewhat awkward sometimes because people need to be stacked. So that's the build that I've been running right now. You can change a lot of things here, because I'm not sold on the double reversions or double rewinds in Mythic Plus. I'm still trying to decide if I want to pick this talent or the reduction in the cooldown. Not sure, still testing it. I like Grey Spirit because I like Reversion Hunt. I really like the Reversion Hunt because I'm hoping to pick up the tier set, and the tier set is going to work with Reversion and is going to add value. You can also spec into Renewing Breath as well and things like that. There's a lot of freedom in here. This is more of like a DPS build to some extent. You don't have to take this as well, but this is what I've been using. Make sure you pick up things like Emerald Communal. I'll talk about this very soon. But what are the main advantages of Preservation Evoker when compared to something like RESTO DRUID? Number one thing to play, or the reason to play Preservation Evoker, is their burst healing potential. Their burst healing potential is absolutely insane. It's unmatched. The fact that the whole group can take damage and dip to 10% HP, and you can top them up in 1 or 2 GCDs, is insane. You have so many different ways of doing it. And you can see my Preservation Evoker here. You have your Spirit Bloom, which is, again, a short cooldown. You have your Dream Breath. The problem with Dream Breath is that it's positioning. There is a positioning requirement to it, and we'll talk about it. But your empowered abilities heal for a lot. You have things like Stasis, and Stasis is going to be used by a lot of people. This is probably the most misplayed talent, including by myself as well, because you need to pretty much prime this before the damage or the oh crap moments happen. Which a lot of the times people just like playing the game, everyone dips low, you activate Stasis, you prime your 3 abilities. Again, Stasis is like build your own Convoke with Cloudburst combined. You activate Stasis, you activate 3 spells, and then all of a sudden the damage is no longer there. And you're like, okay, I have 30 seconds to activate Stasis, but there's nothing happening. This happened to me so many times in Mythic 0 dungeons, because I'm not sure of where to use it on when the big damage is going to be happening. Best things about Preservation Evoker: unmatched burst AoE healing potential. You have Stasis, which requires you to know when the damage happens. You have Tip the Scales, which if you activate Tip the Scales, your next empowered ability is going to be instant cast, which again, if you can aim it properly, it can be really strong. You have Rewind, which again is a very strong ability because it scales in Mythic Plus as well. So now guys, I have to spend a little time talking about Emerald Community, because there's a lot of synergies both in Mythic Plus and raid situations with talents like Lifebind. So first of all, you might read Emerald Community. It's a 3-minute cooldown. It seems like a little bit of a defensive, but the pure healing that you can do, especially in smaller content, it is a cooldown. It's something that you should track in a cooldown row, because it can survive or prevent the whole party from dying. So you might look at ways of improving Emerald Communion even further, because Emerald Communion cannot proc echoes, but you can for example, let's say we have 5 people or whatever, you're going to put out echoes in the party on people. You can either cast echoes by themselves, or you can use, again, in raid situations, most likely run Temporal Anomaly and then run something like Resonating Sphere, which is going to allow you to shoot out the sphere and put out a bunch of echoes on the raid. And then after that, you'll want to use your Verdant Embrace on an ally in a group that doesn't have your echo buff, because that is going to provide you with maximum way of optimizing your life binds and things like that. So let's say you applied echoes on a bunch of people, whether it's in raid or mythic plus, then you have an ally who doesn't have your echo, you use Verdant Embrace on them, you're going to shoot up to them, again, just to showcase it. And then that person is going to get life bind, and all the people who had echoes are also going to get life bind, and then it's going to look like that on your grid too, and you'll follow it up with Emerald Communion. So what's happening right now? All of the people that had your echoes and the person who didn't have echoes but you Verdant Embrace them, they get life bind. Your life bind transfers, again, when you're healing on yourself, is going to be transferred, or a portion of that healing is going to be transferred to the people with life bind. In beta, and a couple of weeks back, there was an even weirder interaction where other healers could heal you during life bind, and you would be the beacon of healing and transfer that healing or a portion of it to the life bind targets. That is no longer the case. That would have been a degenerate raid gameplay or some really weird gameplay introduced. Blizzard nerfed it, so now it's only your healing on yourself that is going to be transferred to the life bind targets. But that is just to showcase that there is complexity to this class, either in Mythic Plus or raids, or how you want to optimize your cooldowns. Again, consider Emerald cooldown a huge burst healing cooldown, something similar to your rewinds or your stasis or your tip the scales, if you use it properly, if you have a little bit of a setup time. Again, very interesting in raids. Another thing that makes Preservation Evoker really strong is the fact that you can use stasis to provide pseudo mass dispel. And I thought this was general knowledge, but a lot of people seem to not know about this. But you can use, for example, you're approaching a bursting week and you want to, you know there's going to be like 8 or 9 stacks or more stacks than that. You can use stasis, and then you can use your dispel on 3 different people. You see, I already used up the charge. You can use it on 3 different people, and then you'll store this dispel for 30 seconds, and you'll be able to use it when people get bursting. Now, if you don't need to do bursting, if you want to use, again, you can dispel pretty much anything with Cauterizing Flame. You can use Cauterizing Flame instead of your dispel in those dungeons. Remember that dungeon with the disease dispel, which is insanely difficult? Before people get diseases, activate stasis, use Cauterizing Flame on 1 target, 2nd target, 3rd target, you get stasis, and then just to showcase it, I'm going to activate it, and then you have 30 seconds to activate it. Everyone in the group gets the disease debuff, you activate your stasis, and then those 3 people are going to get dispelled, and then you can use your dispel Cauterizing Flame on another person. So, without sounding too convoluted, you basically have a way of dispelling every single debuff if you prime it before it happens. So if you can see in the future, and if you know something's going to happen in terms of disease or healing, stasis is going to increase the power of Preservation Evoker immensely. So we're talking about some of the positives of Preservation Evoker: unmatched burst AoE healing potential. You still have ways of providing sustained AoE healing, especially because you have ways of applying HOTS. Like for example, Dream Breath applies a HOT. But if you have echoes on someone before it and you press Dream Breath, there's going to be 2 HOTS. If you apply echoes and then you press reversion, there's going to be 2 reversions. So now I have 4 HOTS on me right now, ticking away. So that's one of the ways of providing sustained AoE healing during moments where everyone's taking continuous AoE damage. Now, I have to mention, when you compare Preservation Evoker's sustained healing to something that of Resto Druid, there is no match. Resto Druid's sustained healing through HOTS, through Mastery, through Adaptive Swarm, through multiple... There's just so much sustained healing that Resto Druid can do. The Resto Druid's burst AoE healing potential mainly stems from the fact of Flourish and things like that. You do have Nature Swiftness, but basically what I'm trying to say, Preservation Evoker is insane at burst AoE healing potential, and Resto Druid's sustain is really strong. So if you like that burst healing potential, I think Evoker is going to be really good. Now, we talked about positives. I do want to talk about DPS. I think a big plus for Preservation Evoker is that their DPS is extremely easy. You're basically using your Fire Breath and things like Living Flame. And by using this, you're doing a bunch of damage. All of the healers are going to come around here and they're going to be extremely jealous of the fact that Evoker basically has a 2-3 button DPS rotation. You do have Deep Breath as well. You have a very simple DPS rotation that is going to allow you to do so much damage with very little effort. Of course, you can also use Disintegrate, especially if you have the energy loop talented in to get some mana back, but you're basically sacrificing 3 essences and you might get caught out because, hey, damage happens, you might not have enough essences to apply your echoes and proc them. You also have a decent amount of utility, you have ways to remove enrages, you have pushbacks, you have kind of like disruptions, you can pick up interrupt relatively easy, and you have bloodlust heroism, which is going to be a really big differentiating factor when picking up or deciding on the meta. Do you have bloodlust in your group? No. Get Preservation of Evoker because they're bringing bloodlust in the group. They have really strong AoE healing. They provide a lot to the party. Now, what are some of the negatives of Preservation of Evoker? And these are some of the reasons why I think Preservation can be somewhat difficult to pick up. If people are not stacked, if people are all over the place, your abilities like Dream Breath can be somewhat awkward. But if people are spread out, you can apply echoes on them. So regardless of where they're in the room, if they're within like 30 yards of you, you can apply echoes, which is an instant cast. And let's say they go all over the place, you can still proc echoes on them by using certain abilities, for example, like Dream Breath. But generally speaking, if people are really spread, there is going to be, how do I say, it's going to be a nuisance. It's going to be awkward, and you're going to a lot of times might go from one place to another, and it's not as easy as it is for other healers who have 40-yard range on majority of their heals. So range and range limitations are definitely going to provide a negative impact to Preservation of Evoker, and I think it can't feel awkward, but like I mentioned, there are ways to play around it. If you're smart, if you play Preservation of Evoker for a long time, you can deal with it. But someone who picks up the class for the first time ever and steps into Mythic Plus and things like that, they might have a relatively hard time. On top of that, you might have problems when there is some sustained healing needed. For example, if you do have sustained AoE or single target healing bosses or Mythic Plus trash or something like that, let's say for example, you need to heal a tank who's going to be taking insane amount of single target healing for a minute straight. There is going to be a point where you're going to be like, hey, I don't have any more abilities outside of Living Flame. Living Flame is like your filler ability. You can go through Mythic Plus dungeons or Mythic Zero dungeons without ever casting Living Flame in order to heal people. Majority of the time, Preservation of Evokers will be casting Living Flame just to DPS because they have enough of a toolkit to deal with a lot of situations. But let's say you do have a single target sustained situation and the tank needs healing for a long time. You do have things like Verdant Embrace, which basically shoots you to the target. But most of the time, people are too scared to use it because you're going to be put into possible dangerous situations. So just proccing echoes on the tank and using Verdant Embrace on yourself can help out. You can use, for example, a lot of people don't do this, but you can use, if you know there's only single target needed or single target healing requirements, you can use Spirit Bloom, rank 1 of Spirit Bloom, to just heal the target, because Spirit Bloom is something that you can mouse over. So there are ways of dealing with sustained, especially sustained single target, but it's not going to be comparable to something like Restoration Druid, who can stack up multiple hots on the tank. For example, double Life Bloom build, they can have Scenario Ward, they can have Rejuvenation, Spring Blossoms, there's just Adaptive Swarm. There's so many hots that Resto Druid can have on a single target, and they can maintain them for a really long time. So Resto Druid definitely has an edge in terms of sustained healing, especially sustained single target healing, but Preservation of Evoker has ways to deal around it if you know how to play it, or if you know what boss or trash pack you're approaching. So now let's go to Restoration Druid, and in my eyes, Resto Druid is the king of sustained healing. The fact that if you're level 70, there's going to be a stamina increase and creature damage increase. All of a sudden you'll notice that your HP is a lot bigger, and your hots tend to, how do I say, maybe possibly overheal a little bit less. Mythic Zeros is not a good way to compare this, because Mythic Zeros, everything just falls over, not a lot of HP requirements outside a couple of dungeons. But once Mythic Plus is unlocked, you'll notice that Resto Druid hots, they're going to do work. You're going to allow your hots to do work, because Resto Druid, again, this is the build that I'm running right now in terms of some of the Mythic Zeros. A lot of things can be changed here. I'm not saying this is going to be the best, but this is something that I'm experimenting with. In terms of the class tree, I think it's extremely important for you to pick up Protect of the Pack. This is going to provide you with a lot of additional damage, and it's going to put emphasis on Moonfire. Moonfire is going to be a big aspect of your Resto Druid gameplay in terms of dealing damage, and Nature's Vigil. Now let's talk about some ways of optimizing or providing passive damage as Resto Druid. We talked about some of the DPS talents. We talked about Nature's Vigil, which seems to be like the bread and butter way of applying passive damage for Resto Druid, both in raids and Mythic Plus. And I think this is an interesting talent because, hey, it's 1.5 minute cooldown. Flourish is 1.5 minute cooldown. You can make a macro where you're going to proc Flourish and Nature's Vigil at the same time, especially during situations when there's a lot of healing needed. you're going to provide additional healing through something like Flourish, and you're also going to provide additional damage because you're combining them together. And again, you might have a scenario where you're approaching a Mythic Plus trash pack or a boss, and you're applying your HOTS because you want to have some HOTS on your party before you use Flourish and things like that. Again, it all depends how you're going to do your Flourish ramp, but you have your HOTS, you're trying to maintain everyone's HP, people are taking a lot of AoE damage, you apply or use your macro with Flourish that activates Flourish, it also activates Nature's Vigil, and you're doing more healing, and that is also providing more DPS, or at least very passive DPS. So this feels pretty good because sometimes even people like to combine this combo with something like Convoke the Spirits, depending on which talent build you're gonna end up going. So there is a lot of ways to min-max your healing, which also min-maxes your DPS with something like Nature's Vigil. And I think that's very, very interesting because it really depends how min-maxy you want to go with your Resto Druid. I think Resto Druid is one of those healers that provides you with different avenues to optimize this healer. Very, very interesting. Now, in terms of the spec tree alone, I'm running the double life bloom build. You don't have to run this in Mythic 0, so you can pretty much run anything right now, but when Mythic Plus comes out, I think the double life bloom build is going to be relatively decent. I think you have to have Adaptive Swarm with Unbridled Swarm. I think you have to have things like Flourish. I think Convoke is really interesting. I think you could remove certain points from here and put it into improved Convoke because it would be, how do I say, you could use it a lot more often in terms of DPS, in terms of healing. But basically what this build and what Resto Druid provides is that you're going to do a lot of sustained healing. You have double life blooms. You can put life bloom on yourself, which is going to proc you things like photosynthesis. Adaptive Swarm is going to jump from target to target. Adaptive Swarm can make up such a big portion of your DPS and healing, which actually feels really, really nice. For example, you can use Convokes for dealing with AoE healing situations or use it to add additional damage. And now in terms of your Resto Druid DPS, there might be quite a few buttons that you might be pressing if you want to really optimize your DPS. A lot of people might even skip Swipe, that's still up to debate. A lot of people might pick up Star Surge because it is an instant cast ability that deals good single target damage. So there's a lot of things you might be pressing in order to absolutely min-max your Resto Druid. You might go into a feral form, apply bleeds, apply trash, depending on how many targets you're facing, then maintaining or making sure you track your Protector of the Pack with a weak core or something like that. Moonfire is a big deal, Sunfire, then using things like Star Surge. Again, there is a lot of things. On top of that, Adaptive Swarm, there's a weak core that tells you when or where or which person to use Adaptive Swarm in order to min-max its damage and healing. So there is a lot of things to keep track if you really, really want to min-max your Resto Druid to an absolute top tier in terms of DPS, because there's a mixture of balanced Druid DPS abilities, there's a mixture of feral form DPS abilities, and then you have your basic Moonfire, Sunfire type of deal. So it's all up to you if you enjoy that kind of min-maxy capabilities of this healer. When you compare Resto Druid's DPS to something like Preservation Evoker, Preservation Evoker has literally a 2-3 button DPS rotation that provides a really good amount of damage. Preservation wins in that term because you don't have to try that hard as Preservation Evoker to do good damage when you compare it to like Resto Druid. Again, I'm only talking about Resto Druid min-maxing. If you're just applying Sunfires and Moonfires all over the place, that's okay. The AoE healing of Resto Druid, a lot of your burst healing potential is coming from something like Flourish. You need to make sure you use Flourish properly. But your sustained healing is so strong because you have Adaptive Swarm. Again, if you have a melee group where you can make use of your Fluorescence, Spring Blossoms, Verdancy, and then you have things like double life bloom, which again I talked about previously, where you can put life bloom on yourself, proc photosynthesis, and all of a sudden your HOTS are rolling and rolling and rolling and rolling, and you can just do whatever you want. The overall HPS values of your Resto Druid in Mythic Plus is going to be really strong. You can go and provide your DPS at that moment, and if you need some burst AoE healing potential, you do have things like Flourish and Tranquility if you need it. Is Druid's burst healing potential similar to Preservation Evoker? No. Preservation Evoker can pretty much top the whole party in a couple of GCDs, but Preservation Evoker is not going to have the same sustain that Resto Druid can have, especially in something like single target situations where a tank, for example, is going to be taking a lot of damage for a prolonged time. Resto Druid, HOTS, Mastery, and all of those things are going to be really, really fun. So without this video being too long, I want to summarize some of the aspects of the two healers. I do think that both of these, Resto Druid and Preservation Evoker, are going to be very sought after when Mythic Plus releases, unless there's going to be certain buffs or nerfs to these classes made, which can happen. But overall, I think the position of which healer is going to be meta is going to be depending on other classes and what is your group. For example, if you have Bloodlust in your group, I don't think you will want to bring Preservation Evoker, because you might want to bring Resto Druid, or Druid specifically because Mark of the Wild is such a strong raid buff. Resto Druid also provides a lot of different utility. It also has a battle res, which is a pretty big deal. So there is a lot of things to be said about Resto Druid being meta in a lot of that Mythic Plus content. You don't have that Bloodlust in that Mythic Plus pushing group. You might want to look at Preservation Evoker, because besides Bloodlust, they also have unmatched burst AoE healing and decent utility. And did I mention that they can do a good amount of damage with just a couple of button presses? Which healer do you think is going to be the most sought after in high-end Mythic Plus groups? I just talked about it. It's going to be dependent on which raid or group buff you're missing. And in terms of pugging, I honestly feel that Resto Druid is probably, how do I say, I don't want to oversimplify the playstyle of Resto Druid, because I think Resto Druid is easy to pick up but hard to master, and I think Evoker is relatively hard to pick up but doesn't have a huge skill ceiling. So you can see where I'm going here. I do think the Resto Druid will have an easier time in pug situations because there is no range requirements. Evoker has that 30-yard limitation, and someone who's new playing Evoker, they might have trouble with aiming Dream Breath in the right direction. So I think in really basic pug situations, Resto Druid might have a slight edge because you're just putting your hots out, you're just pressing Moonfire. But in terms of mastering your Resto Druid, it's going to require hours and hours of dedication. And in terms of Preservation Evoker, once you get used to your Preservation Evoker, once you tell your group, hey, don't be spread all over the place, or if you are going to be spread, stack up for a little bit, let me apply those echoes, then you can spread out, and then I can activate those echoes in whichever way I want. And once you get used to your Preservation Evoker, you will unlock the true potential of this healer, and you will know that Preservation is a very, very strong healer in Mythic Plus when played correctly, when the group knows what's going on. But again, it can be awkward initially when people are spread all over the place. But again, I mentioned there are ways to deal with it. So even this video wanted to compare Resto Druid and Preservation Evoker. I do not have the right answer for you in terms of, hey, this healer is going to be 100% better in every single situation. I think both of these healers are really, really, really strong. They do their healing and damage in a very different way. They have different, how do I say, strengths, different weaknesses. I don't think the question is Resto Druid versus Preservation Evoker. I think it's Resto Druid, Preservation Evoker versus all of the other healers, especially in Mythic Plus content, because these two healers are looking to be very, very strong. Again, anything can change, and I hope that this video has provided you with some insight in terms of how the healing works for these classes, especially in Mythic Plus environment. I didn't talk about raids too much because the raiding talent builds are going to look very, very different. The raiding playstyle is going to be different. I think both of these, Resto Druid and Preservation Evoker, are going to be a pretty decent raid healers when it's going to kick off and things like that. We'll have to see if there's going to be more changes, but overall, if you're looking to push Mythic Plus, I don't think there's anyone better than the classes that I mentioned. Let me know how you feel about this video, and I'll see you in my next guide.